Welcome to the Africa Leadership Dialogues. I'm Julie Gichuru, and it's always a pleasure to be with you. Now, this week on the show, we speak with the chairman of KPMG Africa Limited. He gives us his thoughts on the continent and also Africa's top 10. And this week, it's an interesting one. We're looking at top 10 ranked football nations in Africa according to FIFA. Now we start with Yunus Suleiman. Yunus is chairman of KPMG Africa Limited. He's also a board member of Business Leadership South Africa. He's been recognized with a Professional Excellence Award from the Minara Chamber of Commerce. So what's the potential for Africa's growth in the coming years? What are our greatest challenges and greatest opportunities as well? Yunus shares his thoughts with us. We're joined by Yunus Suleiman, who is the chairman of KPMG Africa Limited. Great to have you with us. Now, I was looking at the map that you have in this report called The African Emergence, the Rise of the Phoenix, which has been released by KPMG. And it looks like you have a footprint across the African continent. So let's start at the very basics. Where are we in terms of growth and development in Africa today, would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. KPMG is represented across the entire continent in the 54 countries that are there, including South Sudan. And I think that footprint actually positions us very well to be able to participate and encourage investment into Africa, and to also be part of the process of helping people understand the challenges on the ground across Africa. So I think from our perspective, we're really well positioned to be working with companies both within the continent and outside the continent in actually going in and looking at opportunities and feasibilities and working with them to ensure that whatever challenges they face, they're prepared for it.
So your report is called The Rise of the Phoenix, and there's a whole buzz about the Africa emergence and, you know, Africa rising finally. Investors are coming in, there is serious interest, but what are they being drawn to on the continent?
Well, currently, I think the big challenge for the continent is that the oil is an opportunity, but also a challenge. And if you look at foreign direct investment over the last decade, it's predominantly following oil. And if you look at the countries that are actually huge in resources in oil, they're attracting the highest amount of investment. So if you look at the Angolas, the Nigerians, Egypt, Tunisia, etc., that's where the majority of the investments are being made. And I think the key thing when I say a challenge is that we need to not ignore the rest of the industries. When I lived in Nigeria for a few years, and some people were saying that oil was a curse. And the main reason they said that was because agriculture was being neglected. And that was where the downside was. Whilst there was lots of money coming in from oil, we need to be careful that we diversify, like we have in South Africa, where in terms of investment, South Africa has dominated the direct investment in the last year or two, mainly because of huge investments from outside the continent into retailers like Massmart, which has really been great for South Africa. But I think going forward, we're going to see a lot more investment into emerging countries. And that I think is important on the continent, especially now when you look at East Africa, especially with the find of oil, and that resource, let's call it reserve, is increasing by the day as the company from the UK explores further. And that's fundamental because we have a huge amount of natural resources. And as you would see with this African Emergence document, it's about the investments following the industries where there's the greatest return. The thing is that what's important is people need to put their money where their mouth is. And that's what we're seeing happening to a large degree. But the challenge that we have in Africa is that we have the diaspora that lives all over the world except in the African continent, and they need to put their money where their mouth is and actually invest in the African continent, including the countries from where they come.
You've just mentioned something absolutely critical. It's agriculture, costs of food across the globe going up, availability going down. And one thing the African continent does have is the space to grow food for the world. Ethiopia right now is growing food for India, for instance. Rice, sugar is being produced. So what are your thoughts on the countries that are getting it right when it comes to agriculture?
That's a major contributor to food security, especially for us on the continent. At the moment, the major, let's call it importers of, let's call it the agricultural, from the agricultural countries, is India and China. But we need to also be careful that we don't necessarily ignore the fact that we need to encourage other countries on the continent to capitalize on their fertile soil and to really educate the farmers and retain them. If you look at South Africa, for example, we've actually lost a lot of skills by farmers moving to other countries within Africa, which is a plus. So we're actually not losing them outside the continent. So I think we need kind of encouragement to retain those specialist skills because, being a farmer is not a simple job. You need to predict the actual market out there. You need to be able to price your products accordingly. And what's helped the African continent to a large degree is connectivity. Because now you would find that a farmer in a rural area using his mobile phone can actually work out the pricing in the market without going to the market. And then be able to price it accordingly to make sure he can export or transfer or sell the products within the continent or outside the continent at the best price. The other thing that is coming through also in recent times is the question of protection. Because, there's always opposition to protectionism in the context of, let's say, tariffs, to protect the importation of products which are much cheaper elsewhere because of the fact that they have surplus. Now, one example is potatoes. If you look at the potato market, there's this oversupply of potatoes elsewhere in the world. And what are companies doing? They're actually making them into French fries or potato chips, as we call it, and exporting it to South Africa at a much cheaper price than the local companies need to buy it from the local suppliers, which is creating a problem because it's like, do you create now these anti-dumping kind of mechanisms that will then protect the local farmer, but that means you're paying a higher price and they could not be necessarily efficient, or you would encourage a combination of the two to say, well, okay, for example, KFC, what do? You import a significant amount of tonnage of potatoes or fried French fries. How do you make sure there's a balance between the local suppliers and the global suppliers? And what the response was that we will commit to let's say, purchasing at least 60 to 70% of our French fries locally. And the rest of it we'll get from importing it from elsewhere. So we're not actually ignoring the fact that even though it's cheaper to bring it in from other countries, we will still retain our local content. And that was a big challenge when we had the investment in Massmart by Walmart. The critical focus was a discussion around, let's protect our local suppliers. And that's what it is. And I think one of the things that we really want to encourage as part of this thought leadership material is intra-regional trade. We need to sell to each other. We need to encourage each other to trade with each other. And that will encourage more growth on the continent. Because in fact, the coincidental thing is when I lived in Nigeria, I was surprised that Nigerians never looked at South Africa as a destination to purchase their clothing. They always went to the UK or the US or the Far East.
It was Europe and the East, right?
And it was more a mindset. And also it was a question of they are afraid of the crime that they perceive to have in South Africa. I mean, it was surprising. And I went down to South Africa for the first time with the senior partner of Nigeria. I was gobsmacked when he said to me, "You better stay close to me. I want you to protect me."
Because it's dangerous here.
Yeah, I want you to protect me. Don't let your eyes off me. And I was like surprised. But that's linked to the actual negative sentiments. that is portrayed on Africa.
Which is very unfortunate, but I think perhaps changing now that the continent seems to be talking to each other more, the different countries. Let's talk about subsidies, because you talked about the dumping of certain goods, and when it comes to agricultural goods, some of these are subsidized and our markets simply can't compete. Do you think that African governments should be subsidizing their farmers' inputs and other things of the kind?
I think it's a difficult situation because there's a balance between, let's say, protectionism and also, call it capitalism or competitiveness. We've got to be careful that where a resource is scarce, it's easier to really protect it in a way because of, there's a higher demand than supplier. But the thing is that we don't want to encourage inefficiency. And that's my concern, is that when you do have these subsidies, there is an element of risk that the subsidies will result in the guys not being as efficient enough and they're not globally competitive. So I don't think it's a problem in having some subsidies. And I think we find it in the Western world all the time. And we tend to be naive sometimes and we say, well, no, we should avoid it and we should try and encourage competitiveness and all of that. So I think, in my opinion, I think there needs to be a balance between the two. In certain circumstances, I would say subsidies may help, because it might be a short-term solution because of the current market environment and the actual costs have spiraled significantly and the actual companies or the actual traders are not going to be able to compete globally for whatever reason. Whether it's the economic crisis or whether it's any other reason, as long as it's temporary. When it becomes permanent, it becomes a problem. But I think in terms of subsidies also linking to incentives, what South Africa has done very well is provided incentives for global car manufacturers to manufacture their cars in South Africa for global export. Now that in a way creates employment. So I think in terms of the actual challenges we face, it's having that balance between the local, call it employment opportunities to create employment and also attracting the right skills. But it's also in the context of how is it going to help the country in being globally recognized as a foreign direct investment destination. And that's what I think is important, is that creating that incentive for these car manufacturers to produce in South Africa has created a huge upside in terms of the actual investment in facilities, technology, research, and creating employment.
Stay with the Africa Leadership Dialogues.
Welcome back to Africa Leadership Dialogues. More from Yunus Suleiman in just a moment. And Africa's top 10 this week, we're looking at top ranked footballing nations according to FIFA. We're checking out the teams. Who's on the list? That's on the way in just a short while. But first, let's get back to Yunus Suleiman and his thoughts on growth in Africa. Let's talk a little bit about the youth bulge on the continent, which is perhaps discussed more than it is addressed. What do you think is the answer for these young people in multitudes seeking opportunities and there's just no way to provide enough jobs for them?
Yeah, no, that's a fundamental area. And I think when we're talking about skills and lack of resources, we introduced what we call a GAP program, a graduate sort of access program. And it was at that stage introduced, or it was supported and sponsored by a senior member of government in South Africa, as an example. And we as KPMG thought, you know what, this is a great initiative. We cannot afford to have graduates sitting unemployed. So we committed to giving these graduates employment for 1 year. And in that year, they had the opportunity to actually develop their skills beyond their academic background. And then we actually employed them permanently, a large degree of them. And then they became a lot more accessible to the job market. So it's that kind of program which is important. So, I think if you look at the continent, you've got a significant number of educated graduates that have actually studied not just on the continent, but studied elsewhere in the world. So this kind of gap program is a good opportunity to help those graduates to get skills and to be more globally marketable, not just in Africa, but elsewhere in the world. Because what we're finding is that people go elsewhere in the world and they bring back experience. It's really great for the country because that sharing of that knowledge helps the rest of the guys develop their skills. But it has to be an outreach program. And that, I think, is something that could be extrapolated across the continent.
That's great for the graduates. Let's talk a little bit about people who don't make it even to perhaps high school level, and it does happen in quite a number of countries. You get masses of people who don't make it into the system for high school and basically are out there. What would you suggest in terms of being able to find something for these people to do, to earn a living, provide for their families? What's the way forward?
I'll tell you about one initiative that KPMG is involved in globally. There's an organization called Students in Free Enterprise. And Students in Free Enterprise is a connectivity of students at different campuses around the world. Now, how it works is you find in a country that there's, let's say, for example, in South Africa, we have 26 different universities participating in this program. So these students from campus are studying for graduation in degrees and have postgraduate opportunities, etc. But their big challenge is they need to participate in going into the communities and seeking those people, exactly what you said, have no education, no formal education, but they're trying to be entrepreneurs. And those students are then identify these projects and work with those uneducated individuals who've got skills to be entrepreneurs and help them uplift that. Now, I'll give you one example. In the province of KwaZulu-Natal, there was a lady that literally ran a construction company with 6 people, with no education and no formal business training. So this university identified her sort of company as a project. They went in and helped her to develop a formal business plan, helped her to formalize her policies and procedures, helped her with her accounting records, and then helped her to diversify or to expand her interest in the construction game. Within a 12-month period, after formalizing, supporting her, she grew her business from 6 employees to 30 employees and will then continue to support her through the journey until she feels comfortable that she's now been, call it educated, even though there isn't a formal qualification, but then she's got the now skills which she never had before. And she will create more employment because she feels more confident and comfortable in the way she can project herself out there. So that's where I'm saying there's another program where these students will help the uneducated to develop skills, because the employment opportunities come from those SMMEs that will help us alleviate poverty.
Absolutely, absolutely. I don't know how to describe what that means to this continent, because you literally have your young people pulling up other young people, and that's fascinating.
Yeah.
What do you see Africa looking like 10 years down the line?
I think, when you look at the opportunities, I would say we have come such a long way from the past, whether it was apartheid in South Africa, whether it is in autocratic leadership, and the politics, I think, have come a long way in democratizing the continent. And after democracy, economy comes in, and the growth and the business opportunities. I think it's time that we're going to be really the shining star in the world. We will have and continue to have higher growth rates than elsewhere in the world, even though China and India are ahead of us in terms of growth rates. But 6% is nothing to sneeze about, and it could be higher. If we increase the extent of inter-regional trade and we uplift our skills and we attract more of our diaspora to come back into the continent and invest here, we'll be a shining star. And I think the continent has already about 1 billion people, and the projection is between now and, let's say, 2050, you're going to have 2 billion people. And what does that attract? The consumers, more consumers, and that's going to increase the extent of middle class, and that's going to create greater growth, will contribute to us exceeding any other continent, any other country's growth rate in the world. So we will be the shining star. There's no doubt about it. Our time has come.
Optimistic. Let me be the pessimist. What is the greatest challenge we face right now?
I think the greatest challenge is the question of the regulatory environment I think that's one factor. But I think the key thing in this environment for our African growth is the corruption. It's these autocratic leaders that are still around in terms of the countries where the economy is down in the dumps because of the way the government actually leads the country. So I think the challenge is how do we get corruption down? You won't get rid of it. I've just come from a discussion earlier on, and I think that there were examples where bribery was encouraged in other countries around the world because you couldn't do business in South Africa, for example, if you didn't do things like bribery or dash. I'll give you a personal example. I mean, when I went to Nigeria, I thought, I don't know the country, so I'm going to take some of my personal goods in a container. So I took it to Lagos, and guess what? It arrived at the port on time, but I couldn't get it out of the port. And I thought, what do you want from me? I've given you all the paperwork, and there's nothing else I need to give you.
You were not speaking the language.
I was not speaking the language, and I was never going to speak the language. Right. And I decided to leave the container at the airport, at the port, and to struggle and be inconvenienced, because I believe in the values that we have. Especially the values of KPMG are fundamental in driving our practice, our reputation, and where we go in the future. So it took me 6 months to get my container, but I never paid a cent.
They gave up in the end.
They gave up. And that's what's fundamental, is that the challenge is you've got to be patient. It will improve, but it maintains your integrity and the reputation of the company you work with. And that's the challenge we need to continue to prosper on, and to be patient and to get over those challenges. But we've come a long way. I think we mustn't always be negative towards ourselves. The continent's time has come, and we need to deal with these challenges as a united front, because human interest brings about selfish interest sometimes, where people want to aspire to get to positions or to get to wealth without necessarily really working for it. And that's a fundamental thing which I believe we should be encouraging on the continent, to get over these challenges, because it takes two to tango. If you don't have a payer, you won't get a recipient for a bribe. You get rid of that, you get rid of the actual limited number of countries now. We've come a long way, a limited number of countries where there are challenges, and together, what could happen is the African Union could be a good vehicle to help get through these challenges in a faster pace, and to help us to really get everyone going. And then there's no reason to really worry about peer reviews and that sort of thing, because you will comply. And when you comply and everyone complies, and the tone is set at the top, that would make sure that we'll achieve more than we're aspiring to do.
Okay. You have access to Africans across the continent right now. Look into the camera and give them your message.
My message is hard work gets you to where you need to be. It doesn't go without hard work. And I'm saying to you guys that I'm encouraging you to work together to make this continent exactly what we're talking about, the shining star in the world.
Thank you so much. And Suleiman is very optimistic, but work needs to be done. And he says, let's do the work together. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Stay with the Africa Leadership Dialogues.
Interesting thoughts there on Africa's potential. We'd love to have your thoughts as well. This is how you can join the conversation.
To take part in our weekly hangouts, go to our G+ page, Africa Leadership Dialogues. On Facebook, Africa Leadership Dialogues. On Twitter, @AfricaLD.
This week we asked you, in your own views, what should be done to improve the standards of football in Africa? Nicholas Namacha says, I believe we have to start at the grassroots, invest in soccer academies and catch the soccer stars young. By maybe 6, a child can enroll into the academy. Alexander Mwema says, "We should develop football structures from the grassroots, and players of our national teams should be selected by merit, not nepotism and tribalism. Lastly, we should overhaul the Football Federation and stop political interference on its running."
And it's time now for Africa's top 10. We're looking at the top footballing champions on the continent by country, of course, the national teams. Let's get straight to that list.
At number 10 is South Africa. They are ranked 60th globally with 502 points. They go by the name Bafana Bafana. The Central African Republic team takes the number 9 slot. They are ranked 59th globally with 543 points. They are nicknamed the Wild Beasts. Coming in at number 8, the Stallions from Burkina Faso. They are ranked 51st globally with 594 points. Zambia's national team Chipolo Polo, which means Copper Bullets, takes the number 7 slot with 602 points. They are ranked 49th globally. The Eagles of Carthage from Tunisia come in at number 6. Tunisia's national team is ranked 42nd globally with 502 points. At number 5, we have the Fennec Foxes of Algeria. Their global ranking is 35th with 737 points. The Super Eagles of Nigeria stand at number 4. They are ranked 31st globally with 785 points. The West African nation of Mali's national team stands at number 3. The Eagles are ranked 23rd globally with 869 points. Coming in at number 2 are the Black Stars from Ghana. They are ranked 21st globally with 887 points. And at number 1 in Africa and standing at number 13 globally are the Elephants of Cote d'Ivoire with an impressive 1,022 points. That's Africa's top 10 this week.
And from that, we move to our quote. And this week, we take one from a telecom magnate, an African man who succeeded in the telecom industry and has decided to give back to the continent. You know his name, Mo Ibrahim it is. And of course, the Mo Ibrahim Award given to African leaders who have shown exemplary service to their people and who have, of course, retired from office. And in the words of Mo Ibrahim, "It is my conviction that Africa doesn't need help, doesn't need aid. It's a very rich continent. There is no justification for us to be poor. The problem is governance. Without good governance, there is no way forward." As always, it's been an absolute pleasure. I'm Julie Gichuru. Bless you and bless this continent of Africa, and I look forward to seeing you again next week.